So the legend of the fall of Adam indicates that we are here for the purpose of learning and evolving. And as Iqbal says, it indicates man's rise from a primitive state of instinctive appetite to the conscious possession of a free self, capable of doubt and disobedience. The fall does not mean any moral depravity. It is man's transition from simple consciousness to the first flash of self-consciousness, a kind of waking of the dream. So man's first act of disobedience is also his first act of free choice. And Iqbal emphasizes that according to the Quran, there is no compulsion in goodness. Freedom is a condition for goodness. And by giving us, the finite ego, the power to choose, the ultimate ego is actually taking a massive risk. But he goes on to point out that the fact that God takes that risk shows his immense faith in man and is a means by which to test and develop the potentials of the human being. Iqbal's concept of and philosophy of Khudi really develops this faith in man's potential. So Iqbal has that faith too, and that's what he's really calling us to. So who are we, and what is the nature of the self? Well, in chapter 4 of his Reconstruction of Religious Thought, Iqbal actually lays out that the Quran emphasizes the individuality and uniqueness of man and has a definite view of the destiny of that unit of life. So according to the Quran, he outlines 3 things about the ego. The first, and here in terms of terminology, when he uses the term ego, I think, these days prefer to use the term self or selfhood, because there's too much scope for the ego to be confused with Freud's ideas of the id, the ego, and the superego. But I think he's essentially talking about self and selfhood. And so he points out that there are 3 things the Quran tells us about the self. That man is the chosen of God, that man is meant to be the representative, the Khalifa of God on earth, and that man is the trustee of a free personality which he accepted at his peril. And just another note about terminology, I'm using the word man, but I'm a woman, and actually when he talks about man, I think he's talking about man and woman, but I'll come back to the gender thing because it did come up for us in our reading group, because a lot of Iqbal's imagery and what he seems to call people to is a question of whether he's addressing men or he's addressing men and women, and I'll say something about that a bit later. So what is this ego, this self? Well, if I ask you just for a minute or so to think about, if I was to ask you where your self is, and I was actually asked this question in my interview for a psychology undergraduate course. The guy said to me, where do you think your psychological center of gravity is? So if I was to ask you, slight variation of that, where your self is, where would you say it was? Okay, I'm not going to ask you to give me the answer, but I just want you to think about it for a few seconds for yourselves personally. Okay? So you can see what a big question it is. What is our self? Iqbal points out that it's actually surprising that the unity of human consciousness, which constitutes the center of human personality, never really became a big point of interest in Muslim thought. And that's apart from Sufism, which actually attempted to understand the meaning of the unity of inner experience. So, and it's strange because actually the Quran points out knowledge of self as one of the key areas as sources of knowledge, and that's alongside knowledge of nature and knowledge of history. So in terms of the Sufi perspective on the unity of inner experience, Iqbal points out that this kind of culminated, developed in the famous words of the Sufi Hallaj when he says, I am the creative truth, for which he's killed. So somebody having found out who they thought self was gets his head chopped off.
Just his head.
Yeah. We won't go into those gruesome details. And Iqbal says, okay, so that happened, and how are we to interpret that? Because that experience that Hallaj describes, or is outside, it's not accessible to most of us. So what can we actually understand from it? And he says this really poses a dilemma for Muslims. How do we come to understand the self? And what is the modern Muslim to do if he or she wants to develop that self? And this is the task that he addresses in chapter 4 of his Reconstructions. And the way he does this is the way he does lots of things in his book, which I think is a good model or an interesting model for us to think about or follow. And what he does is he engages with the modern knowledge of his time with a respectful and independent attitude. And at the same time, he brings in the teachings of Islam in the light of that knowledge. So it's quite strange in places. He'll literally follow through a concept in terms of like modern debates around it, and then he'll just throw in a verse from the Quran and develop it further in that way. And he says, that this is part of his reconstruction of Islamic thought, because he says we need to break from we need to develop our knowledge without breaking from the past, but also to be prepared that we may differ in what we conclude from those that have gone before us. And you can see that boldness and that daringness in the questions he asks and in the answers that he develops. So, using the modern knowledge and psychological theories of his time, and he draws on the work of people like Bradley and William James, he begins to reason through, so what is the ego, what is the self? And he says, Bradley actually points out that for him a test of reality is freedom from contradiction. That would be the real with a capital R. And since the ego or the self is actually riddled with irreconcilable oppositions of change, permanence, unity, diversity, it could be actually argued that the ego, the self, is a mere illusion. And even modern day psychological theories, especially social constructionism, would argue that too, that there isn't a core self, that actually what we do is we construct a notion of self, and that self is a mere illusion because it's constantly changing and in flux. But despite that, most of us still have a sense of self. We still have an idea of, or a feeling of something more solid of who we are. And so Bradley, in his time, also reluctantly, kind of having admitted this, goes along with it to try and see, well, okay, what other features are there of the ego that might help us in understanding the self? So he points out a couple of things which are important to hold on to, which is that the ego is a unity of what he calls mental states. These do not exist in mutual isolation. They mean and involve one another. And the organic unity of these states is a special kind of unity. So what that means is that the way these mental states interact with each other can't easily be depicted outside of the self, because they don't exist in spatial relationship to one another. You can't say, he says, you can't say, I have a belief here to the right and a belief here to the left. things kind of coalesce and overlap and interact in ways that aren't so easily defined or predictable.